Teaching is something that you have to be pretty wholeheartedly committed to in order to make it sustainable. So I think that, like, for me personally, I was always really interested in the connection with students and building relationships with them, and I knew that that was something that long term was going to make me happy. I think that, like, if you're thinking about, oh, like, teaching is a job that I could get and that's why I should do it, or if teaching is something where you're like, oh, that's a salary that makes sense for me, I think that those are, if you walk into with that approach and it's not student centered, then I think you will find it very challenging for it to become a sustainable career for you. Um, and so for me, I was always focused on the kids, the impact that I could have on them, and I continue to be. And I think that is what has made teaching a long-term career for me. Hi, my name is Leia. I am a teacher at George Bush High School in Fort Bend ISD here in Houston, and I teach high school math. So I went to Rice University for college. I majored in economics, policy studies, and I have a certificate in civic leadership as well. There's multiple options. So some people choose to be an education major in college, and so that's kind of considered, I guess, more of like a traditional path, and that's where you study education for all 4 years. You go through like specific training while you're in college. Here in Texas, you actually do not need to have like a master's degree or any like education degree specifically to become a teacher. So like I said, I was an economics and policy major, and basically here all you need to do is spend about a year in a certification program where you learn about how to be a teacher. And you need to you need to pass a couple of tests. So one kind of about the content that you took, like a test about mathematics from grade 7 through 12, and then one about kind of general like teaching pedagogy. So I think most people know or have a conception of what a teacher does every single day. So, I go to school and I have lessons prepared and I teach students. I teach pre-calculus and statistics. So I have those lessons about those topics prepared. When I'm not sitting in front of students teaching a lesson, then I might have time kind of off by myself in my classroom, and that's where I'll get time to plan lessons, grade assignments, design materials, maybe meet with my coworkers about lessons that we plan to teach in the future. I Other teachers on my campus as well will coach sports. They'll lead clubs, and that's also something that's a part of their job. That's not something I've ventured into. I think I'm still learning how to be a teacher, even going into my third year of teaching. When you think about your teachers, you kind of picture them like standing in front of you and the lessons that they teach and the time that they spend with you when you're a student. Something that I didn't realize is how much extra work goes into being a teacher and how much time you have to spend on your job outside of like your official time that you're working. And so for me, in my first year of teaching, I worked anywhere between 60 and 80 hours a week. So yes, we did get those breaks, but I think in a way it is kind of just a way to recuperate from the intensity of the school year. And then in addition to that, especially over summer break, a lot of teachers will spend time doing professional development. So for example, I'm going to go to some courses about how to be a better math teacher, or how to be a better teacher in general, how to work on my behavior management with my students, things like that. So I will be spending at least a week or two in total, specifically going to courses and things like that. And then I'll also use some time this summer to prepare my lessons for next year, reflect on the past year, kind of get ready for everything. Absolutely not. And for me, I walked into teaching pre-calculus my first year of teaching. That was something that I actually really struggled with when I was in high school. I was not good at that class. When they told me that I was going to be teaching it, I was like, maybe you should find someone else. Like, I don't know if that's for me. And I think that you might not know the answer to every question, and it's important to own up to that for your students. So whenever someone asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, I say, I'm sorry, I cannot answer that question at this time, but let me get back to you. And I always have like a million sticky notes on my desk personally, so whenever someone asks me one of those questions, I write it down, I research it, and I come back to them the next day or a couple of days later and say, this is, the question you asked me, and this is the answer. But you don't have to know everything about everything to be a teacher, for sure. So I guess kind of on the topic of working with parents and families and students' households, that is a really important relationship to build. And so I guess that was something that I hadn't really considered when I walked into teaching. Like I guess I didn't really realize I was like a pretty good kid for the most part, so my parents didn't really get a lot of calls about me. But it is, I think, really important to walk into the year understanding how important that relationship can be. I think the way that it looks does depend on the grade level that you teach. So if you think about teaching a kindergartner, those are parents who are really necessarily invested in what's going on with their students each and every day in the classroom. And so a lot of elementary school teachers will do like little newsletters and they'll send home pictures and things like that. My students are older, they're 17, they're 18 years old. And so when an issue arises, I think it's important, especially from the perspective of their development and their wanting to be more independent, that I try to work the issue out with them. And then maybe after we come to a resolution to whatever's going on, I might call home and say, hey, I just want to let you know this happened today, but we talked about it, we figured something out. And so I think, yeah, that relationship looks different depending on the grade level that you teach, but I've always found it to be a lot less scary than I would think to work with parents and to have a strong relationship with them and supporting their students. I think that if you ask any teacher who loves their job, and I do love my job, it's not really about the money. It's about the sense of fulfillment that you find from working with students and from getting to kind of share with them and build relationships with them. It's definitely challenging. I think here in Texas and in the Houston area, we're very lucky to make a relatively good salary. I mean, my salary is public knowledge, so like I can share that this year I made $55,500. And I think that for like, I guess as compared to other parts of the country, that is a relatively high salary for especially like a relatively inexperienced teacher. But I think if you are ever feeling deterred by the salary, just think about kind of the joy that can be found in teaching. For me, I had the opportunity to seek out other job roles where I might have made more money, but I don't think that I personally would have found, I guess, the happiness or the fulfillment in my job doing those types of jobs, and that is definitely what keeps me going, despite the salary maybe not being as high. So do I teach the same thing every single year? Not necessarily. I think that it does depend on the school that you work at and the administrators that you work with. So I'm very lucky to work with a team of like my principal, the assistant principals at my school, who are very receptive to teachers who want to have the opportunity to grow. And I think if you're ever unhappy teaching what you teach, then you always have the opportunity to say, no, like I think I would rather teach this instead. Maybe in 5 years from now, I would say, oh, I don't really want to teach math anymore. Maybe I want to teach social studies. Well, I would be able to go out, get my certification to teach social studies, and then make that move. So I think you always have the opportunity to make the change if you really feel unhappy with the specific content that you teach. But I also think that even though I'm walking into my 3rd year of teaching the same exact courses, it really does not get boring to me. Sometimes I will say, like on a day-to-day basis, when you've taught the same lesson like 6 times and you're at the end of the day, it gets a little boring to hear yourself repeat the same words. But I think that like year to year, there's always changes that you can make, different ways to approach things, different ways to teach lessons. And I always have like a running document of just like, these are like random ideas that I have for lessons that I could do. So I change things up, keep things interesting for myself. And I think a lot of other teachers do that too, because we're always trying to get better, teach the best lesson that we can. And that definitely keeps it interesting. So I guess like thinking about how to promote sustainability within my career, I think that there's kind of 2 components to that. So one is that we are always learning behaviors from others and picking up on the habits of others that we are around on a very consistent basis. So for example, I'm big on like recycling. And if my students, like I see them throw a piece of paper in the trash, I'm like, no, like we know where that belongs. And I think that like having that sort of like habit that you begin to teach them as a teacher, that's something any teacher can do regardless of grade level, regardless of what your students look like and what your community looks like. Another way that I think obviously you can have an impact is through the lessons that you teach. For me, I I guess, lucky in the sense that I teach math, yes, but I really have the opportunity to bring in a lot of like outside issues and kind of what's going on in the world to my students because I teach statistics. And so creating a very socially conscious curriculum is something that I have been committed to since like day one of teaching, and that I continue to be committed to. So I do incorporate into my lessons things about climate change. So we'll examine data about climate change in Houston and how that's led to a rise in flooding, for example. And so I think really creating a critical consciousness and the skills to understand the world around them is something that I work on with my students, and that I would work on with my students regardless of what type of math that I taught, and teaching them those skills to better understand the world around them and to think critically about what they see in the news and what they see on TV. That's a skill that I teach my students that will really help them become better members of our community. So work-life balance is definitely a tricky topic for teachers. I think that there is a tendency for a lot of teachers to be very wholeheartedly committed to their work, and that can definitely lead to the work-life balance being more tilted towards the work side of things. In the first few years of teaching, I think that is something that I definitely struggled with, is finding that balance, because there's so much to learn. I feel like when you're a student and you watch your teachers in the classroom, you don't understand like the number of things that they're thinking about and what is going through their head and how much they're doing at the same time. So like, yes, like I understand how to like help other people learn math. Like I was always the friend who was helping everybody with their homework, doing things like that. But there's so much more that you're thinking about while you're teaching, and those were things that I was still trying to learn, still trying to figure out. Like I didn't have a good workflow, I guess. Going into year 3, I think I've done a lot better of a job of creating that balance of not staying too late at work, for example, like getting out the door we usually finish up around 3. So just like kind of putting my work down and being like, it'll be there tomorrow, like it's fine. And I think that having a commitment to work-life balance is what gives you the balance, if that makes sense. So instead of like letting myself get caught up in all the things that I could be doing, I had to kind of find a way to say, okay, this is enough. My students are learning, and that's what matters. If I could provide any advice, I would say try to talk to lots of teachers before you make the decision to become one. I think that I had maybe one idea of what teaching would be before I stepped into it, and I wish that I had had the opportunity to kind of get a variety of perspectives on what teaching can be like and why it is such vitally important work, but also kind of the challenges and the roadblocks that might exist. So if you have the opportunity through your college to do observations, that was something that I got to do when I was in undergrad, was talk to and observe other teachers teaching and see what that was like in a variety of schools and communities. And that really informed my decision, like, yes, this is right for me. And I would also just consider the beginning of teaching is very challenging. I think my first year, I kind of alluded to that earlier, was very, very challenging, and it was hard to find the balance, hard to figure out what would work in my classroom and what wouldn't, and all of those things. And so those first few years can be hard, but when you find your groove, when you figure out what works for you as a teacher, what works for the school community at which you teach, then I think you start to find a lot more of the joy and a lot more of the happiness, or at least that has been my experience.